I am going to take us into the realm of activism, and thank you, Dr. Tar, and the panelists. This has been an incredible evening. I want to talk about the importance of the film festival from the perspective of data. We know that women are underrepresented. We know that women are underrepresented on the big and little screens and also behind the scenes. And I want to provide some specific data that looks at this. But the context is that this is all data from the US, which is where we have data from. I am conducting the first global study with the Gina Davis Institute and Plan International on media representations of women in 19 countries across the globe. We just don't have that data. But what we do know is that about 60% of the data consumed around the globe comes from the United States. So unfortunately, this is a very good reflection of just how underrepresented women are in entertainment media. First off, a study from the Annenberg Center finds that in the past decade, male speaking characters outnumber female speaking characters 2-to-1, and it's not getting better, despite more than a decade of activism from a number of organizations that have been fighting for this. Whether it's the Center for the Study of Women in Film and Television at SDSU with Dr. Martha Lausen, or the Annenberg Center at USC with Dr. Stacy Smith, or the Gina Davis Institute, or Common Sense Media, or Darnell Hunt at UCLA. It is not getting better, despite the fact that we have raised the alarms. We raised them a decade ago, and in fact, if you look at the industry, if you look at Hollywood, the alarm was raised in the 1960s with federal complaints about the lack of representation of women and people of color in the industry. There have been 4 complaints where over time, where the federal government found that indeed Hollywood is vastly underrepresenting certain populations, but didn't do anything about it. So as much as Hollywood likes to act as though it is progressive, right, and we've got boycotts of not working in Georgia and not working in Alabama over the abortion laws, at the end of the day, Hollywood's hiring practices look like the 1950s, and this sets the tone for global media production and who is represented and whose stories are told and whose stories matter. So the symbolic annihilation of women and girls across the globe, you can trace this back to the value that Hollywood places on girls and women. When it comes to leading ladies, 1 in 3 major blockbuster films over a 10-year period, 1 in 3 are women, led by women, and this is actually a dramatic improvement. This number just a decade ago was 10 points lower. So we are seeing some movement of female leads, but no other area. When it comes to looking at this intersectionally, we know that 3 of leading women from the past year this is actually from 2015, 3 were underrepresented racially, and these numbers look the same in the last 2 years as well. We also know that it's mostly young women, right? So we know that we have a race bias, we know that we have a gender bias, and we have an age bias when it comes to representing women. And in addition to them being mostly missing, when they are presented, they're presented in highly sexualized ways. So whereas men get to be all sorts of characters, right? They get to be young, they get to be old, they have better racial representation, although still an underrepresentation for people of color, men of color. But we know that they get to be ugly, and they get to be pretty, and they get to be anything. They get to see themselves in many different ways. And women don't get that luxury. We're typically shown as sex objects. This can be directly linked to what happens behind the scenes. We know that only 4% of directors are women, 13% writers, 1 in 5 producers are women, and composers are less than 2%. So again, Hollywood's hiring practices look like the 1950s. They're not being held accountable. They are not being held accountable to the 1964 Civil Rights Act and all of the hiring laws that have been put into place. And the question we have to ask is why? Why is Hollywood still where America was, half a century ago when it comes to its hiring practices? And we know that this matters. The reason we know this matters is a couple of studies, one from the Gina Davis Institute that I directed on the Scully effect. We went back to girls and women who had watched the X-Files when it was really hot, right? Not the incarnation now, still a hot show, but back when it was the most popular show in the United States. And we went and asked women in STEM and women not in STEM. We compared compared the two groups, and we found that 61% of women who went into a STEM occupation said that Dana Scully inspired them to do so. 61%. So that's an incredible effect. It means, as Marian Wright Edelman said, you can't be what you can't see. So she was the first scientist that we saw in a leading role on a television screen who inspired a generation of scientists. And we know today that the CSI effect is alive and well, that girls who watch CSI and girls who watch shows having to do with forensics are driving an absolute explosion of women going into these careers. And the effect is even larger for girls of color in terms of going into STEM and seeing characters on television. So we know that media can be, as it is by and large, a detrimental tool, right? It's a double-edged sword, but we also know that it can be an incredible purveyor of values, and it can open up worlds that we simply don't see unless we have a screen in front of us. And so I will end on a positive note, that really we just need to harness the power of media in order to change the world in which we live. Thank you.